This is the agency's role in reporting payments on the new 1099 NEC. For those that have attended fall conferences in the past, we've always had a presentation that included some of our 1099 information. This year, we've had some changes that have recently been updated in SFS as of over the weekend. I'm not sure if you received any notification from SFS. They did send out an email blast, and some of the will point you in the direction of their resources, but there's been some updates that occurred just over this weekend. So this is a very dynamic presentation for some changes that are brand new. Hopefully you can use this to help you in your everyday processing of vouchers as they relate to 1099 reporting. Again, as I mentioned, my name is Bob Lehman. I'm from the Bureau of State Expenditures. From the Office of the State Comptroller, Suzanne Trzynski will also be joining me. Suzanne and I have been doing 1099s in the Bureau of State Expenditures now. Collectively, we were talking this morning about over 20 years. We have a lot of experience working with the agencies. As I mentioned, if you've attended fall conferences before, we've probably met in passing. Same with Suzanne. We've both been with State Expenditures for a number of years and have been helping out either on the vendor management team and or working on 1099s. So here's a roadmap for the presentation today. A few things that we want to go over. We're going to provide just an overview of the 1099 reporting process. As I already mentioned, we've always included 1099 reporting in one of our presentations from the Bureau of State Expenditures during the fall conference. It's usually just a piece of a larger presentation. This year, with some of the changes that are going on, we thought that it was necessary to provide a presentation just on 1099. So that way we can get the correct folks in the room. That may be some of our voucher processors and some of our finance office folks to ensure they have all the information on the changes that went live in SFS over the weekend, as well as just to be able to provide that overview of the 1099 reporting process. As I just mentioned, but we're also going to be talking about processing payments for non-employee compensation. So as in with the name of the presentation, the 1099 NEC, non-employee compensation, we're going to talk about that new form that was instituted by the IRS actually for tax year of 2020. We've already issued 1099 NECs to our vendors, but now our system provider, Oracle, has provided some updates to our system, the SFS system that we implemented, and we want to talk about those changes so that you're ready and can continue to process payments reportable for 1099. We're going to talk about some of the 1099 miscellaneous updates. As I mentioned, the 1099 NEC is new. That 1099 non-employee compensation used to be reported on the 1099 miscellaneous. Since it is no longer there, the IRS has also updated the 1099 miscellaneous form. Some minor impacts on our day-to-day operations at the voucher level, and we were going to go over those. We're also going to go over some of the common 1099 reporting issues. So, there are times where, we are not all perfect. We make some errors in processing of our vouchers that end up creating errors on 1099s that go out to our vendors at the end of the year. And we want to talk about what some of those issues are so the agencies are aware and can hopefully, rectify any issues that may cause some of these reporting issues. And of course, questions. We'll have a question and answer at the end of this presentation. But again, please feel free to submit a question in the chat. Just our learning objectives today. We want to understand those changes in the SFS system, the statewide financial system. Hopefully everybody is going to be familiar with that. If I do mention an acronym that somebody's not familiar with, I apologize. Please ask the question in the chat. Again, if you have the question, I'm sure somebody else does. So what are those changes in our SFS system that were made over the weekend to ensure that payments reportable on the 1099 NEC are coded correctly, and just go over some of those changes, as I mentioned, for the 1099 miscellaneous. We want to understand the importance of processing vouchers correctly to facilitate 1099 reporting. Again, we need to ensure that those vouchers are being processed correctly, because if there's an error on the voucher, it will result in an error in the 1099 that we send out to the vendor and to the IRS. So there's significant impact both on the state expenditures who needs to make all those corrections, as well as the vendor. This could have tax implications on that vendor. And then we want to just understand some of those common 1099 reporting error or issues that result in errors and penalties. Just like you personally, the state is not free from the IRS, and we can be subject to receiving some errors and penalties from the IRS, which we usually receive annually. And we just want to talk about what that impact is on the state, as well as that impact that could be on your agency as well. So again, today's goal, I've mentioned it numerous times, but we want to answer all of your 1099 reporting questions. If you have a question regarding 1099, today is the day. We want to get all those questions answered to make sure that, all the agency folks understand how to report 1099 reporting right from the voucher all the way to the vendor and the IRS at the end of the year. The federal reporting unit, as I mentioned before, is in the Bureau of State Expenditures. Our unit is responsible for issuing 1099s to our vendors at the end of the year. Vendors that receive over $600 in reportable payments will receive a 1099. It is our responsibility to collect all that information through the year as the agencies are processing those vouchers and to issue those 1099s to the vendors at the end of the year. The federal reporting unit consists of about 8 members of the Bureau of State Expenditures, and we issue about 40,000 1099s to our vendors and to the IRS annually. On top of issuing 1099s to our vendors, we also address questions from those vendors and those 1099 recipients who receive 1099s in the mail. And we handle about 1,000 phone calls from vendors, either because they don't know why they received their form, or if there's an error in the reporting, an error in the 1099 form, we have to make those corrections. So we receive a significant number of phone calls and help desk tickets once those 1099s are mailed out to our vendors. As I mentioned, state expenditures, we do issue those 1099s to vendors who receive more than $600 in a calendar year. We issue 5 different types of 1099s to our vendors. New, as I mentioned, it's already been in practice from the IRS perspective, but we just made some system changes. So for tax year 2020, so those 1099s that we already sent out back in January of 2021 for tax year 2020, tax year is obviously a fiscal year or calendar year, January 1 to December 31st. Any vendors who receive non-employee compensation, and we'll get into what is non-employee compensation and what that process and that new form looks like a little bit later in the presentation. We also issue the 1099 miscellaneous that has a few different types of income that we report to our vendors. If we pay vendors interest, whether it be for late payment interest or there's interest on some type of settlement payment or any type of interest that we pay to a vendor, we have to issue a 1099 INT. The state of New York also is in the business of purchasing some land. There's a few specific agencies. I'll just name one, which is the Department of Transportation. They purchase a lot of land on behalf of the state, with their construction projects, whether they need to widen a road or they seem to be putting in all these traffic circles. So they're buying a lot of property from folks as they need to expand their area to put these traffic circles in throughout the state. But they need to purchase land, and it is we have to issue a 1099-S for the folks that the state purchases lands from. And then we also issue a few 1099-Rs. They're for pensions, retirements, and annuities. There's a few agencies that we issue 1099-Rs for, and we have a working relationship with those agencies to know which payments need to be reported on the R. This is just a quick summary of some of the volume of 1099s that we issue. On average, we issue between 35 and 40,000 1099s every year. This is for year 2021. So these are issued January 2021 for tax year 2020. Obviously, due to the pandemic and COVID-19, our numbers were a little bit lower in 2021. As you can see, we issued 21,000, just over 21,000 1099 NECs, so those non-employee compensation. That is that new form. This is the first year that we had issued that form. In prior years, the 1099 NEC and MIS numbers would be as one, because all that non-employee compensation used to be reported on the MIS, but it is no longer reported there today. And you can see the number of the miscellaneous 1099s that we issue has significantly decreased. The majority of our payments is for non-employee compensation. And then obviously the INT, S&R, just a small volume based on the total number of payments that we make from the state's perspective annually. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne, because I'm sure you're tired of listening to me for now. And Suzanne and I will just kind of work ourselves back and forth throughout the presentation, and I'll see you in a couple of minutes.
Thanks, Bob. So as Bob mentioned, a little bit of what the Federal Reporting Unit does in state expenditures, and in our role of issuing these to the vendors and to the IRS, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the agency's roles are in the 1099s, because it's the agencies that really drive this process. So if you weren't aware, it's the voucher that generates the trigger to record a payment as reportable. So we do have a vendor file here in the state of New York that has some default settings that are open, who we believe should be receiving 1099s, or could, I think is the right way, could receive 1099s. But it's really the agency's responsibility on the voucher to tell us what, where that information should be reported. So the withholding amount is something that's on the line level of the voucher, and there is what we call withholding classes, which we'll share in a few minutes. We'll give you a nice chart, but it's on the voucher line level that you can say that this payment amount can continue to be reported to as the default is set up, or it should not. So that's where we're asking you guys, as whoever in your agency is your voucher folks, that they are knowledgeable in this 1099 information and that they trigger the right information for 1099 reporting. So the voucher is what generates it. So as I said, it's opened. The voucher is defaulted to a certain withholding class, ready for payment purposes, and you can either remove that information or change the withholding class to what it should. So when the vouchers are being done, we would, state expenditures would ask you to select those collect withholding classes. 1, 3, 6, 10 is new. We're going to talk about that, and even maybe what form it should go on. Here is our chart of some common areas state expenditures has always had. So this is a great chart to print out and put in your cubicle wall to assist you as you're doing those vouchering. So basically the changes that happened over the weekend through SFS was to help facilitate, our end of pulling the data to report on the form. Basically behind the scenes, in generality, nothing has really changed. We're reporting the same payments. We're just changing what form we're putting it on. So the 1099 miscellaneous, we always used common 5 boxes. The most common, and why we default to the withholding class for non-employee compensation, the IRS has pulled out and created its own form. So what we would call the default would be that for the 1099 and NEC is where we report the majority of our payments, and you can see that's when Bob told you we're at 21,000. So that definitely is the most common reporting type, and that's why we set it as the default. Some of the other withholding classes that are common would be if you're submitting a lease payment, you would use the 1099 miss class 01, and that actually translates to the form number. The 1099 miss box 1 is where we would report leases. Some other common payments would be it's other income that was reported in class 3. Our client workers, our work for pay, those in the sheltered workshops at OMH and OPD, we would report those in box 3. Our jury payments, if you sit on grand juries and earn more than $600, we report those on 1099 miscellaneous 03. The loan forgivenesses from higher education we report in line 3, as well as any other prizes, awards, honorariums, just general stipend type payments would go in class 3, as along with some settlement payments. So anything that's IRS looks as really other income, not something that's subject to self-employment tax, just needing to be acknowledged on their 1040s. Those all go in box 3, so class 3. Hospital medical payments, IRS asks to report in class 6, box 6. And the change this year would be, because they decreased the boxes on the form, our settlement payments to attorneys, those payments, just those lump sum payments for the settlement, would go in box 10. So that's the bulk of the payments within the settlements. If we were just going to pay the attorney for their services, then it would go in on the new form NEC class 01. And that again is our generic for any services that we provide. So this is a good chart to have at your desk to refer back to. And it's also in the GFO if you ever should want to go and reference it there.
So we have our first question here.
Thank you.
No problem. And the question is, I'm going to read it. Can you verify what the proper 1099 code, or the withholding code, would be for payments to vendors under the OGS Administrative Services contract? And the example would be if providing temporary nursing services, which I know we are doing we have a number of purchases in that area right now. What is the standard vendor services? Would it be on the NEC 01, or would it be medical care miscellaneous box 6? So let me preface this by the fact that neither Suzanne nor I are tax attorneys. Our role is ensuring that, we report the payments based on how the agencies code the payments in and on the 1099. And I know you're asking a very specific question as to where those payments need to be reported on. I believe that those would be reported on the 1099 miscellaneous box 6. However, I would verify that with your legal and ensure that those payments are being reported in the correct area. On top of that, a lot of these nursing services, if you're paying a company and they are a corporation, they would also go in, 1099 miscellaneous box 6. So generally corporations don't receive 1099s, but for healthcare provider services, they do receive a 1099 miss box 6. So if it was an NEC 01, we would not have to report it at all if it was a corporation. But if they are a corporation and it is for health services, it would be the miscellaneous box 6. Again, I would want to 100% validate and verify that with your legal team or some of your experts in that area. But I would lean towards miscellaneous box 6. And Suze, do you agree? Or
I agree. I was going to say I would agree.
Okay, perfect.
Yep.
So we can, in these instances, when we have specific questions as to what box information needs to be reported on, we can help guide, based on our experience. But a lot of that, we can either refer, to the agency's legal, who has a lot more information, particularly about the specific programs that the agencies are doing. If for some reason there is still some confusion, we do have some of our own attorneys here at the Office of the State Comptroller that can help assist us. But I think I'm pretty confident with miscellaneous box 6 there.
Yep. And we can look at, I think Bob has some voucher information down below, and we'll talk a little bit more if you need specifics of how to do that on the voucher. But just to move us along a little bit. So each voucher is recorded on the line level, whether if it's reportable or not, in what withholding class it should be. But we all understand that things can happen. New folks, knowledge happens after the voucher has already been submitted for payment and paid. And then we move into our 1099 corrections. And that's where Bob said we have some staff that handles different aspects of the correction process. So once a voucher is submitted to OSC and is paid, that sort of becomes the book of record, and we don't change anything on the voucher. If it's determined that vouchers were information on the voucher was incorrect or the wrong code was used, then our federal reporting unit can definitely step up and make those corrections. We just do that before those 1099s are submitted. It's a standalone system that comes out of SFS, and we'll just make those corrections. So we would ask if you, as soon as you know that information like that has occurred throughout the year, because we run on a calendar year for 1099s, that you would just email us and, let us know the voucher number, your agency, and then we would, we'll just track all of those and make those corrections. So I think why we share this information with you is because as we report the 1099s to the vendors, we also report this information to the IRS. And if we do not follow their regulations, New York State is assigned penalties and interest. And that can be for a variety of reasons. If we don't report on time, we get there's a penalties. If we report information incorrectly, such as the name and the taxpayer identification number, that'll come back in penalties and interest. So we asked you at the agency level if you could comply with our guidance as much as possible to avoid any of these penalties and interest. If so as things happen throughout the calendar year, the sooner you let us know of some issues, the quicker that we can get on top of it and make those corrections and avoid any penalties and interest that might translate back to you at the agency because we were not in knowledge of it.
Good morning again. Thanks for that question. It was great. Please continue on with your questions throughout the presentation. So now we're going to go into the new 1099 non-employee compensation form, the NEC form, and those changes that were made just over this weekend in SFS, and how that will impact the way you process vouchers in SFS. So the IRS introduced the 1099 form for tax year 2020. It's actually not a new form. This form was used by the IRS many years ago, way before I even started working for the state and issuing 1099s. I won't say it was actually even before I was born, but it was. So this is not necessarily a new form, but the IRS is reusing the 1099 NEC because it hasn't been used since the early 80s. So as I've mentioned a couple of times in the presentation, prior to tax year 2020, non-employee compensation was always issued on the 1099 miscellaneous in box 7. It was, as you could see the volumes from the earlier slide, it was our largest volume of payments reported to the IRS was in box 7. So now we've transitioned from box 7 over to the NEC. All right, so before we get into this information, so the reason why the IRS has reintroduced the 1099 NEC is because they have changed the dates when this information and these payment types are actually due to the IRS. So when I first started with 1099s back in 2013, all the information for payments made to our vendors was due to the IRS on March 31st. The IRS determined that, unfortunately, that information was not being reported to them timely, and they updated their policies to ensure that 1099 non-employee compensation, obviously it's taxable to the vendor in most cases, and on the vendors or the individuals' tax reporting forms to the IRS, that information they needed to receive that information by by January 31st. So they've updated their policies, all non-1099 NEC information due January 31st. The other information that was on the 1099 miscellaneous form was still due to the IRS by March 31st. So it was really hard to differentiate from our system and our process to say, all right, well, this 1099 had 1099 NEC, so we have to send this one to the IRS by January 31st. The other ones can all go March 31st. And the IRS recognized that as an issue with all the reporting entities, and they thought it would be easier to break out that non-employee compensation, a whole form just for that particular type of payment. And that is what is due to the IRS by January 31st. Again, just from IRS regulation, all 1099s are due to vendors by the end of January, no matter what type. The vendor has to have it in hand so they can do their tax reporting. This is the dates that the information is actually due to the IRS. So we send it out to the vendors, paper form, we mail it to them. And then our system, we electronically file all the information with the IRS. So, they can audit the information that vendors are submitting or individuals are submitting on their tax forms to ensure what they're reporting is what we reported to them during the year. So what is non-employee compensation? Non-employee compensation is payments to vendors. They can be individuals, they can be partnerships, they can be an estate in some cases. And they can actually be corporations as well, who is not an employee of the state, and they're working for fees or commissions, and compensation for services are performed. So I know that's a mouthful, but those are really vendors who are not state employees who are providing some type of service. A common example I use is training services. The state hires a number of different folks to come in and potentially provide some training. If they are a non-employee, and they are not a corporation, that information and that voucher that we're paying that individual or company or business vendor would be reportable on the new 1099 NEC, and it is non-employee compensation. Again, any of those consulting services, if the vendor that is providing those consulting type services, is not an employee, they're not a corporation, they're going to receive or should be receiving a 1099 NEC, non-employee compensation. Those vouchers should be reported to that vendor and marked as 1099 reportable payments when processing those vouchers in SFS, because a 1099 is required to be reported to that vendor. We have a note here, and I'm going to go back to my training example, but generally speaking, reimbursements are not 1099 reportable. So one common issue that we find every single year that vendors call in to say, hey, my 1099 is incorrect. When an agency is processing a voucher to an individual, a business or a vendor, non-corporation, for training services, there may be an agreement that, the state will also cover travel. So if the trainee is coming to an agency or there's some type of travel involved, so the amount of money that is reported to that vendor for the services, for the actual doing of the, performing the training, that would be reportable under, the 1099 NEC. However, if there's, related travel expenses and that traveler provides the receipts to the agencies to say, I'm requesting a reimbursement for my travel expenses as agreed to, then that amount and information is not 1099 reportable. A lot of times those payments are reported on the same voucher, different lines on the voucher. And as Suzanne mentioned, 1099 reporting is on the line level of the voucher. So, the line for the services performed, the actual physical training would be 1099 reportable. The line for travel would not be reportable. So the agency would need to go in and make those adjustments on the voucher to ensure the payments are paid correctly on the voucher, to ensure that the 1099 created at the end of the year based on that voucher information is correct. This is just a copy of what the new 1099 form looks like. Those that are familiar with the 1099 or miscellaneous, there are a number of different boxes where amounts are reported to the vendor, and we have a 1099 miscellaneous that we included in the presentation as well. But this is what the new 1099 NEC looks like. All the information that we are reporting to those vendors on the NEC will be in box 1 for non-employee compensation. It's the only box that we're going to report information into or information on to the vendors in box 1. So this is just what the form looks like. So as Susie mentioned, and we've mentioned a couple of different times, it's no longer just the 1099 miscellaneous. So that was where pretty much all of our payments were reported prior to this past weekend and the introduction of the new 1099 NEC. So now when agencies are creating vouchers, not only they have to determine, or not only will you have to determine as a voucher processor, is the payment reportable or not, you must also determine what form the payment is reportable on. Is it reportable on the 1099 miscellaneous, or is it reportable on the 1099 non-employee compensation? And that is where that list that Suzanne had talked about, all the different types of payments that are common for the state, that's in the GFO. And she mentioned printing that out and just throwing it on your desk. That is important to have, because as you're processing vouchers and processing payments, the questions that you need to ask as a voucher processor: is this payment reportable? And if it is reportable, is it on the 1099 miscellaneous, 1099M, or is it reportable on the 1099 NEC, the 1099N, as it is referenced in SFS? So as we've already mentioned numerous times, October 24th, this past weekend, SFS, the SFS agency, has updated the SFS system to incorporate the new 1099 NEC reporting. And I forgot to mention in the beginning, and I apologize, but we do have a few representatives from NEC or from SFS on the line. So if you do have a technical question, our SFS folks are here today and can assist when answering all those questions. So we do appreciate them being part of this. We are a partnership between, OSC, Bureau of State Expenditures, and SFS, and we really appreciate, all the time and effort that they put in updating the system so we can ensure that we're meeting all the IRS regulations. So over the weekend, we've updated the system. And as I just mentioned, as you're processing and as voucher processors are processing vouchers, we will have to make the determination: is the 1090, is the payment 1099 reportable? If so, on what 1099 is that payment reported? The 1099N or the 1099N? I apologize that they're so close. The M and the N. And then we have to also determine the withholding class. So we used to refer withholding class to like 1099 box. What box was the payment going to be reported in? We now use the term withholding class. So if it's a 1099N, it's withholding class 01. It's the only area, it's the only class that we're going to be reporting 1099 NEC on, as I showed in that overview of the NEC form. If it's the 1099M, so if you have a payment that's reportable on the 1099M, you'll also have to determine which class. It could be class 01, which is rents. It could be class 03, which is other income. And again, that list that we presented earlier, and I think we have it again in the presentation because it's so important, lists some of those common payments that would be reported in box 03. Withholding class 06, which is those health and medical payments that we discussed in that question that we received. Or is it withholding class box 10, which is the proceeds from settlements to attorneys? That would be reported in withholding class or in 1099 miscellaneous box 10. So I do see a question here. Am I correct in assuming the selection of the 1099 type and the withholding class will be at the AP voucher? And that is correct. It will be at the accounts payable voucher. As Suzanne mentioned earlier in the background section, all vendors are set up as a default to produce a 1099 at the end of the year. So that way, if an agency is creating a voucher for a payment, 1099 reporting is turned on. So that means the payment, if the agency does nothing else, will create a 1099 at the end of the year. That may be the correct answer, may not be the correct answer. Going back to that example I gave, if the agency is processing that voucher that includes a service and as well as travel, if the agency does nothing to that voucher in the withholding area, the travel portion is going to be marked as reportable and will be reported on the 1099 at the end of the year, which will be an error. That vendor will end up giving us a call saying, hey, my 1099 is incorrect, and we're going to have to make that correction. That could lead to an error from or a penalty from the IRS. So it's really important that when the processors, the voucher processors are processing these vouchers, they go into the withholding section of the voucher to ensure the withholding is correct. That the default information, and we talk about that a little bit here in the vendor registration section of our presentation, but then agencies that are folks that create voucher or create vendors, they also have to select the vendor classification that will identify the default information that is on the voucher for 1099 reporting. We'll get into that a little bit further in our presentation, but they have to make sure that information is correct. This is just a quick overview of the withholding class information, the new withholding class information. So as agencies are processing vouchers, this is kind of what I was just referencing. So on the voucher itself, on the voucher information tab of the voucher, there's a link on the right-hand side. I have it circled in red, is withholding. So, as a voucher processor is entering this information, selecting the vendor, they need to go to the invoice information and the withholding section of the presentation or of the voucher. This is the screen that will come up when you select withholding information. Each line of the voucher will be listed. On the line, the processor will have to select the correct withholding code. That withholding code will default the information that's within the withholding details. So on this example here, the withholding code is N01. So that's 1099 NEC withholding class 01. And you can see that information defaulted down below. The type, 1099N, class 01.
Hold on, Bob, we have a question.
Oh, all right. I'm sorry, I missed it.
No, that's okay. I'm thinking he's probably thinking what everybody else is. So if I understand the new withholding codes, the old 7 is now N as in Nancy 01. In our voucher bulk load files, we would need to send N01. What if we send 07? Will the voucher fail to load in SFS? And that's a great question because Bob's just about going to talk about bulk load. So the screens he's showing now are for voucher individuals.
Online agencies, Sue.
Online agencies. Yep. So he's just going to move to the bulk load information.
So I'll answer both of those. I really feel like this is a two-part question. If I understand the new withholding code, the old 07 is now N01. That is correct for online agencies. It will be correct for bulk loads at a future date. So, Scott, if you're from a bulk load agency, you do not have to make any changes today. I will get into that in a second. But just generally, 07 is now the N01. We have another question. Can the withholding be established at the purchase order level? Otherwise, as part of the P2P, the invoices are to match and pay automatically without any necessary voucher review and approval, and that is correct. You will select the withholding at the purchase order level, and that will default through onto the voucher and process correctly. That is a common error, Melissa, and an issue we actually dealt with, particularly with the real estate module when that came online. A lot of those, payments for leases need to be reported in box 01. If those POs for the leases were not updated to 01, they were being reported in box 07, which was the default at, and still is going to be the default, the 07, now the N01. We have another question. When is it safe to leave the IRC, or I'm going to guess the IRS code blank? It will be blank if the payment is not 1099 reportable. So, if the agency makes a determination that the 1099 is not reportable because it is not a reportable type of payment, so it's not a lease, it's a payment to a vendor.
For goods and service, for goods, maybe, right?
Yep, for goods. Yep, that's another example would be goods. Or if the vendor is a corporation, it's determined that the vendor is a true corporation, not an LLC. LLC stands for limited liability company. They, an LLC could be a corporation, but it may not be a corporation. That's a common, just general IRS 1099 regulation error. So an LLC, limited liability company, may or may not be a corporation. So if you can determine that the vendor you're doing business with, that vendor you have that relationship with, they are definitely a corporation, then you can leave the IRS code blank because they do not need a 1099. How do you know if a 1099 is a corporation? You need a copy of their W-9. Their W-9 will identify their vendor type. It's also an affidavit. They're signing it to say that the information that I provided is correct. It will include their name, their taxpayer identification number, their TIN, which would either be their business employee identification number or their social security number, and it will identify their business type. How are they set up? Are they a corporation? Are they an LLC? Are they a partnership? Are they a sole proprietor? They will identify that on the W-9. As somebody processing payments on behalf of the state, you can always ask a vendor for a copy of their W-9. They probably are very familiar with that process. And to be honest with you, the state also receives payments. We are frequently asked for our W-9 for, folks that are going to be making payments to the state of New York. Hopefully that answers all of the questions so far. I'm just going to circle back to the presentation again. Withholding class in this next example is 07. So this is the withholding class is 07. That is the old code. But we wanted to give this example because for bulk load agencies, and Scott, this will help answer your question. If a voucher comes in with the old code, which is 07, the withholding details, the system automatically ensures that the payment is going to be reported on the 1099N in the withholding class 01. Again, N only has one withholding class, which is 01. So for all users, the withholding classes that are available, if you were to select that small magnifying glass, you'll see all the withholding codes that are available. The existing codes, so 01, 03, 06, 07, and 10, and 14 are still available. We are asking that all the online users select the new withholding code information. And so the old codes are still listed to support our bulk load agencies. However, there is a date and time to be determined when bulk loads will also need to begin using and updating their systems to the new withholding code information, and the old withholding codes will disappear. So, as I just mentioned, you select that magnifying glass on the voucher for the withholding code. You'll see the existing 01, 03, 06, 07, 10, 14. You're also going to see the new withholding codes, M01, M03, M06, M10, and 01. we're asking all online agencies to begin using the new withholding code information. And as part of the upgrade that occurred over the weekend, POs, vouchers, information have been updated. If they were, an O1 before, they're going to be an M01. If they were an 07, they're going to be an N01 moving forward, because that information is not going to be reported from the 1099 miscellaneous to the 1099 NEC. I'll let that sink in for a second. I feel like I just covered a lot of information, and that is really, what is changed over the weekend.
We have a couple of questions too in the chat. So do you know, can we help them where the 1099 code is at on the PO level? We don't have screenshots of that. It might be something we need to get back to them on.
Yes. So I know we've got a couple of questions. If that questioner can send us your contact information, we will ensure to follow up and point you in the direction on the PO level. I know we have our friends from SFS. Liz, do you happen to know where that may be on the PO? And can we help Liz unmute if she has an answer?
Hi, Bob. I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yep.
So at the purchase order level, it's actually established by the location that's associated to the vendor on the purchase order. As part of our implementation this weekend, we updated the withholding code, the type and class on the vendor location, which pulls to the PO based on the location. The actual withholding code detail isn't stored at the PO level. So it's all driven by whatever location is associated to that purchase order.
And then Liz, and the location's going to drive it from the default from the vendor file, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So in those situations, if the information comes from the PO into the vendor, into the voucher, if there's an issue, then we would ask those agencies, we can correct that, right? So if the default is going to the NEC box 01 because it's non-employee compensation, and you're doing the PO that it needs to go to medical, then we would just ask you to email our federal reporting unit, and we can get our vendor management folks to correct the default, because we are paying hospitals. It should go in box 6, and we can make that happen.
Yeah, so absolutely the onus is on the AP processor when creating that voucher to review and confirm whether or not the default is proper for the payment being initiated. And if not, update it to the appropriate withholding, or if it's not reportable, as Bob indicated, to uncheck the withholding applicable box.
Yeah, I think we have to circle back around on some of those PO questions, because we're getting another question on PO, and I thought we could affect the withholding at the PO level. And I can see the agency's concerns because, and I know we're slightly off topic at this point, but if a PO is set up and there's vouchers that are going to pay automatically, and that somebody's not going to go in and touch the voucher, how do we ensure that the withholding is correct on the voucher based on the PO, even though we may not want to change the default at the vendor level because they could be doing business for another type of payment? So I think we have to follow up on our side, and we can get that information back to the agencies on how that process works from the PO to the voucher for proper withholding.
Great. Yeah. So if I would just ask Bob if the participant could provide as much information, if they have a particular vendor or purchase order that they would like us to leverage in our response, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, and it looks like those questions are coming from a few different users. So if we could just make note of that, and if those users that have those questions, Melissa and CB Buttle, if you could just provide us your contact information, that would be great, so we can follow up specifically with you. And we can also, validate and ensure our guidance and the GFO is correct too. Because I understand where your question is, where your concern is. I just need to educate myself in that area and make sure that I give you the right information and we don't provide you with the wrong information. And I think we've already mentioned this, but Scott, based on your question, 1099 reporting for bulk load agencies, it is not changing at this time. You'll continue to still use the old and existing 1099 withholding code information. So that 01 and 07, which will produce that 1099 NEC Box 1 at the end of the year. Again, that is for a finite amount of time. We don't have a date or time when that's going to be changed. We want to make sure that the bulk load agencies have the time they need to be able to update their systems, because that will be a system change. So we're implementing this for online users right now, the new withholding type and code, and it will be coming to bulk load agencies at some point in time, and we will make sure that you have plenty of notice to ensure that systems are going to be upgraded. And at that point in time, we will probably cease the use of the existing and current withholding codes on the vouchers. So, online agencies will no longer see the traditional codes, but we're asking you, online agencies to use those new withholding code information, the M01, for example, or the N01. 1099 Miss. Suze, are you taking this section?
Yep. So we're just going to, again, just reiterate some of the things that Bob just went over. So the 1099 miscellaneous, the change, the form NIC, the form NEC took the formerly box 7 and moved it to a new form. So the non-employee compensation, again, that's mostly any services that are provided to the state of New York are now reported in the new NEC form. The other change that happened on the 1099 NISS form is that because of the reduce of boxes, now we report those gross proceeds to attorneys to box 10 and not box 14. So that's going to be the change in the withholding class numbers because the boxes changed. So no longer would we, in the future where we have 14s, we're really using box 10. Okay, so here's just some of the new, just to reiterate the boxes that we're using on the 1099 miscellaneous form. Box 1, 3, our medical payments, and 6, and then the change from 14 to 10 for the settlement payments. I'm just going to show you, here's the 1099 miscellaneous form and the boxes that we use. They're box 10 and how that should go. The attorney's proceeds go to 10 and not to 14, just to give you a little bit of information of what the form actually looks like that the vendors receive. And you can see box 1 and box 3 for the other income and rent. So we just want to talk a little bit about vendor registration and how these codes might affect the information in the vendor file. So the vendor add process is actually the beginning of how we get vendors added to the vendor file. And as vendors are added to the vendor file, the vendor add staff in the roles of the vendor add will make the determination of what type of vendor is being added to the vendor file. And at this time, we use the word classification, right? What that vendor classification is what will drive our withholding class in with 1099 type. And to try to facilitate some of that information more easily to our vendor ad clerks. So here is the vendor ad page of, in case you haven't seen it before, for those in that role. Down below, you'll see that there was a withholding type and a withholding class, or withholding, class, but that is generated from the classification of the vendor. So here, as this test vendor was added, we picked a procurement supplier. Those are those that are providing the services to the state of New York, and that automatically is going to populate the new withholding type and class. So 1099N in box 01. So I just want to talk a little bit about vendor classifications as they're also in the GFO, but how we've, SFS and State Expenditures has tried to default them to make it a little bit easier on everyone to make this determination. So our general services or goods, but services are what's reportable. So as you select that procurement supplier on the vendor ad page, it translates to the 1099N and class 01. Other classifications that we have are our non-procurement service providers. Again, mostly that is our folks in the mental OMH or OPD world, where they're the client workers, the respite providers, those that don't necessarily have a purchase order involved, but they are performing some type of services to the state. Those are defaulted to also to class class 1099 and class 01. Our recipients, most recipients don't receive 1099s, but some do. The loan forgiveness are the majority, or our master teachers that receive that other income, those individuals. So we, as a global, chose to report that on 1099 miscellaneous, class 03, that is reportable of other income. So we've defaulted that in. And we've also, these are not necessarily more common classifications, but we also can see sometimes within the vendor ad process that sometimes classes aren't chosen correctly. So we've just defaulted all of these to the normal, the bulk of the payments, 1099 and class 01, which we see the most, just in case the wrong classification is chosen. The default for the 1099 is the most common, 1099 and class 01. And therefore it is open to withholding. And then at the voucher level, that information can be removed. I'm just going to pick it back up and do 1099 for land claims, 1099S, and then another 1099 INT.
Perfect. Thanks, Suze. The only nice part about being at home and presenting from home is I'm trying to find the answer about PO right now on our GFO. So I may have an answer by the end of the presentation. So in addition to the MIS and the NEC, we also issue 1099 INTs for 1099 interest and 1099S for our land claim purchases. So again, 1099 INT, these are for interest payments to a vendor, all interest payments over $600. So if a vendor receives over $600 in interest payments, with the exception of corporations, will receive a 1099 INT. As we've talked about through the presentation, when you are processing a voucher for 1099 miscellaneous or 1099 NEC non-employee compensation, you have to select the correct withholding code and type the correct 1099 type and withholding code. When processing a voucher for interest, that'll be reported on the 1099 INT. We pull information to be reported based on the agency's account code. So there is a list of account codes on the next slide. I just want to make note that it's super important that when an agency is going to issue a 1099 or a payment for interest, that they use the correct account code, but also on the line level of the voucher, they must leave the withholding type and class blank. If the payment is, an interest payment, the agency uses the interest account code, but leaves the default information on the line level of the voucher, that amount will be reported in two places. It'll be reported on the 1099 INT because of the account code, but it'll also be reported on the 1099 MIS or the NEC based on the line level information for 1099 reporting and withholding. So it's really important that if you're making an interest payment, that you ensure you remove the 1099 withholding information on the line level of the voucher and use the correct account code. These are the account codes that are listed in the GFO for your reference. Late payment interest is automatically generated in the SFS system. Agencies do not have to do a separate voucher. That information is already calculated and has the correct account code when making payments to those vendors for late payment interest. So no need to worry from the agency's perspective for late payment interest. But any of those interest payments, that are going to be paid at the voucher, on the line of a voucher, need to ensure they use the correct account code. The 1099S, I only have one slide here because it relates generally to just a few specific agencies. If your agency is purchasing land or is involved with a land purchase on behalf of the state, there's some really detailed GFO guidance, a step-by-step process of how you need to create and process vouchers to ensure a 1099S is actually created. You'll be affecting the handling code of the voucher. And again, similar to like the 1099 INT, you will need to remove any references for withholding at the line levels of the voucher. Again, if there's information there for the withholding codes that are related to the MIS or the NEC, the payment will be reported twice on both different forms, which is incorrect. We need to ensure that we use the handling code for the 1099S. Again, a lot of this is for DOT. I know our friends at SUNY, DEC and Parks sometimes purchase land, but DOT is our main agency purchasing land, and we work very closely with them through all these transactions. Again, we're talking a very small number of 1099s that we create for land purchases. If you're purchasing land and you're unsure, again, GFO, and if not, just reach out to our unit and we can help you walk through that process. We'd rather you do it correctly and help you through that process rather than, make those errors in SFS that'll create the 1099 error at the end of the year. So there are payments that are made outside of the statewide financial system or payments that are made via a single pay. So generally speaking, our rule is if there's a payment that is potentially 1099 reportable, a vendor should be created and a payment should be processed through our vendor file. There are special instances and agreements that we've made with agencies to be able to make 1099 reportable payments through either a single pay voucher or a payment that may be made outside of the statewide financial system altogether. We do have an accounts payable bulletin, which was recently updated. Our AP Bulletin 32 discusses the process for these types of payments. I'll just give an example of payments that are made through a single pay that are 1099 reportable, and that is our jury payments. So we work very closely with our friends from courts. They make payments to juries throughout the year or jurors. If a juror makes over $600, then that juror will need to receive a 1099 because they are not a vendor on our vendor file. When we run our end of year reports, that information is not captured. So courts needs to send us a file of all the vendors or all the jurors that they paid that received over $600, and they need to fill out the template that is part of our accounts payable bulletin 32. So if your agency makes a 1099 reportable payment outside of the statewide financial system or does not use our vendor or is using a single pay and that payment is 1099 reportable, one, we should already have an agreement with your agency if it's a single pay vendor. If it's not a single pay vendor, you should be creating a vendor through our vendor file to ensure that payment is reported at the end of the year. As I mentioned, there is a template attached to accounts payable bulletin number 32. If you're one of these agencies that are making these types of payments, you will need to complete that template and submit it to our bureau so we can create those 1099s, because these payments will not be part of our end of year reports for creating 1099s. So that's just something to be aware of if that's one. These are payments that your agency makes. So I just wanted to talk about some of the common 1099 errors. We have about 15 minutes left of our presentation. So again, any questions, please throw them in the chat. We will get to them. If we are run out of time, we will make sure that we get the answers to you. So include your contact information. But these 1099 errors are what causes corrections to be made at the end of the year. The Bureau of State Expenditures is processing and getting ready to issue 40,000 1099s between January 1st and about Martin Luther King weekend. So January 15th, we have to get all the information in our reports, make any corrections that agencies made throughout the end of the year or throughout the year, and then we mail these 1099s off to our vendors. If there is an error that has been made, throughout the year that we're not aware of, that we weren't told by the agency, hey, I made a mistake, we are going to end up issuing that 1099 based on the way the agency processed the voucher in the system. If it is incorrect, the vendor will call us and say, hey, listen, the amounts on my 1099 are correct. Or in some instances, a vendor may call up and say, hey, I didn't get a 1099 at all. And that's because, the agency inadvertently or decided that they thought that payment was not supposed to be 1099 reporting and removed withholding on the voucher level, and that 1099 was never created. So those are, really the main error and the main issues that cause these errors are the agencies when they're processing the voucher. So it's super important the agencies are aware of the rules and regs and can, identify the payments that are 1099 reportable and now what 1099 form they need to be reported on, and in what withholding class that payment should be reported. So it's super important that this information is correct. We're processing thousands and thousands of vouchers throughout the year. So it's really important that we make sure that this information is correct, because otherwise it creates a lot of work and corrections on our bureau at the end of the year. So that kind of summarizes a lot of the errors. It really starts at the voucher level. The other thing we need you to work on with us is, a lot of times you have a working relationship with our vendors. We've made a significant improvement to our vendor portal, and vendors need to go in and ensure that the information that they have on the vendor portal is correct. Our bureau is managing hundreds of thousands of vendors, where your agency may be working select with a finite number, or you have a working relationship with our vendors. And a lot of vendors have signed up to receive direct deposit payments, which is great. That's one of our initiatives. But when a vendor receives an ACH, they may forget that the address that we have on file for them is incorrect. So although they're still receiving their payments direct deposited into their bank account, they may receive a 1099 at the end of the year. And if the address is incorrect, then we need to ensure that the vendor goes in and updates their vendor address through the portal. It's super important because last year we've got over 600 returned 1099s, and those vendors either, request a reprint. So again, they need to contact us, or they need to be able to find that information, or they may not even be aware that a 1099 was issued to them, although it was their responsibility to report that information on their tax forms. But we really need to make sure that the vendor addresses are correct. And I see we have a question here.
So the question is, should vendor payments that are 1099 eligible not be made via Citibank procurement card to enable proper reporting? That's not really an issue that the Citibank or who does handles our credit card, they will issue the 1099 to the vendor. So, all of our other proper guidance to say when you can use the procurement card and leverage the discounts for the use of the card. Yes, you make those payments and they should be receive a 1099. Citibank will do those 1099s for us. So it's not, that should not be a hindrance, and that doesn't really affect in your decision-making process to concern yourself if a 1099 is reported. That'll all happen naturally through Citibank. So continue to use the procurement card when appropriate.
And Suze, I'm going to take it to the next level where, I would encourage from a 1099 reporting perspective for agencies to use your procurement card, right? We have a lot of initiatives, some guidance out there of when the appropriate use of the procurement card is required and should be used. And it really makes our job from a 1099 reporting perspective easier, because Citibank will issue the 1099 and not New York State. So I would encourage the agencies to use your Citibank procurement card when, in accordance with our guidance. From a 1099 reporting perspective, it makes our job easier. So continue to do that. Common causes of penalties, as I mentioned, we have these errors, we have corrections that we need to make, and then the IRS will potentially impose penalties against New York State. In my experience, we've gotten penalties in the seven-figure amount, over $1 million. And just even as of last year, we got penalties in the amount around $50,000. Ultimately, the Bureau of State Expenditures works with the IRS to see if we can reduce or abate those 1099 penalties altogether, so the state of New York does not have to pay them. And we've been very successful in ensuring that our taxpayers from the state of New York are not required to pay these penalties to the IRS because of really errors that are potentially preventable and are made by state agencies when it comes to voucher processing. We just ask that you take as much make conscious decisions when processing vouchers to ensure the payment information is correct. As I mentioned before, a common issue where a 1099 may not be created. So if an agency, does not process that voucher correctly and leaves 1099 reporting blank or removes withholding, but that payment is a reportable payment, and the vendor calls up and says, "Hey, where's my 1099?" Well, a 1099 was never created because there was an error at the voucher level. State expenditures will have to manually create a 1099 for that vendor. And more than likely, it's going to be after that January 31st deadline that we talked about. Since it is past that deadline, there could be a penalty imposed by the IRS. So if it's a vendor who's doing business with one agency, if we do get that penalty, we're unable to get out of that penalty. We may, come to the agency to say the agency is responsible for paying that penalty to the IRS if we're unable to abate it and get out of that penalty. Another common issue is if the vendor's name and taxpayer identification number is incorrect. So as we all know, if a vendor is added to our vendor file, the vendor is TIN matched before it actually goes on our vendor file. So this error is not necessarily for payments that are processed using a vendor ID. These are payments that are processed outside of our normal daily process. So single pay vendors, or as I mentioned, payments that are processed outside of our system. Well, these are all those payments that would be applicable for accounts payable bulletin number 32. So we need to ensure that the taxpayer name and identification number TIN matches. So we work directly with those agencies that are making payments through single pay or maybe outside of our normal SFS system to ensure that the taxpayer name and identification number match the IRS records. We will be reaching out to those agencies that we normally receive information from here shortly in the next couple of weeks to ask you for files so we can begin this process. But if your agency makes these payments and has never, reported them to us before, we ask that you reach out, send an email to the Fed Rep mailbox to say, hey, listen, we make these payments. They're outside of SFS. We believe they're 1099 reportable. Let's work on a relationship, and we need to send you some information to TIN match to ensure this information is correct, because this is a significant number and dollar amount of penalty. I believe the penalty is actually in excess now of $250 per each TIN and name mismatch. So we get a significant penalty from the IRS for this purpose. And just coding errors that are identified and corrected after the filing deadlines, similar to the first process, but we need to really ensure that those vouchers are processed correctly, because if we're not meeting our deadlines, errors were made, it's impacting the IRS and their process. It's impacting our taxpayers, our vendors. That could result in a penalty as well. We got a question here. How do we handle TIN matching when setting up a new vendor? So if you go through the traditional vendor add process, as Suzanne covered during the presentation, once the agency creates and enters that vendor through the vendor registration process, our vendor management unit will TIN match that vendor. And if it TIN matches, a vendor will be created. If it mismatches, it goes on the TIN mismatch report, and it's the agency's responsibility to review that report on a daily basis. This is happening every single day. And if that vendor is on the mismatch report, you need to reach back out to the vendor and understand and try to get better information. Obviously, the name is incorrect, so maybe there was a name change at the business, or somebody changed their name. There may have been a marriage, so there's a name change. Or if a vendor, has a whole new taxpayer identification number, a new EIN number, that could cause a TIN mismatch when vendors are added to our SFS file. But again, that will happen. You will see those mismatches on the TIN mismatch report, and our vendor management team is TIN matching new vendors added every single day. So that happens via a process. And I believe there's some guidance in the GFO, Joe, about the vendor registration process and that mismatch report that you could reference as well.
I was going to throw our VMU email, and he can always email us if he has a concern.
Okay.
I'll throw that email in the chat.
All right, perfect. Here's just a really quick summary. We all know that the 1099 NEC is new for this year. Started for tax year 2020. We'll be issuing the NEC again next January in 2022 for tax year 2021. Agencies are now required not only to identify if the 1099 is reportable or not, but on what type of 1099. So the 1099M or the 1099N, and the withholding class, that 01, that 03, 06, 10, or that 1099N01. And again, as we've already talked about, but as errors occur, corrections need to be made. You need to notify the federal reporting unit. We will, make those corrections at the end of the year. And unfortunately, if there's corrections or errors that are made when processing vouchers that are not corrected, it can result in errors and penalties from the IRS. So here's just a listing of all the resources that we've referenced today. There are sections of the GFO talking and discussing, our federal reporting, processing payments for federal reporting, the vendor registration process, and vendor classifications, which really identify that default 1099 withholding type and class. There's also a couple of accounts payable bulletins. They have recently been updated with the new information based on the changes that occurred in SFS over the weekend. So we have accounts payable number 32 and 71. There's also numerous resources in SFS Coach and SFS Secure. So SFS had sent out an email just the end of last week discussing these changes. They have published a quick reference guide for 1099 reporting, which is really great. So in addition to that listing of the payment types that Sue said print out and throw in your cube, you may want to print off that reference guide, and that information is all available in SFS Secure. So if you don't know how to access SFS Secure or need information, you can also reach out to the SFS Help Desk and they can help you get that information. Jillian, I got your email here about that 1099 issue, or the 1099 PO issue, and we'll get back to you on that as well. And here's just some of our contact information. Again, as I mentioned, the SFS Help Desk, they have a local number and a toll-free number, as well as the email address. Our 1099 reporting unit, the Fed Rep at OSC, that's where you need to email those corrections or have general 1099 questions. Please email our email box. We'll get back to you. And then if there's any vendor management related issues, as Suzanne mentioned, you can reach out to our vendor management unit and they may be able to assist you as well. And I think that wraps up most of our presentation. If you want to, Bob, is there a question? So I know we've been asking questions throughout the presentation. We are at the end of our time. You can continue to add questions to our chat. If you have a specific question, please email the federal reporting mailbox. I'm keeping an eye on that along with our team. So if you have a specific question, please email fedrep@osc.ny.gov. We appreciate everybody's time today. This information is, hopefully you can use it in your everyday and also use it to train new folks that may be new to voucher processing. It really 1099 reporting begins at the voucher process. So to ensure and make sure that errors are eliminated, it starts at the agency and at that voucher. So we really appreciate your time. We appreciate those folks and our friends over at SFS for making themselves available today. I know, and I apologize, we're unable to answer that PO question, but we'll get that information out to everybody. So there's a question that just came through. Where do you change withholding for single payment voucher? There is no withholding on a single payment voucher. It's only for vouchers that are processed using a vendor ID. So if you're using a single pay voucher for a payment that should be 1099 reportable, if we don't have a relationship with your agency already that we're aware of, those payments should be 1099 reporting. You should either reach out to the Fed Rep unit, the vendor management team, or consider, our guidance is to ensure that you use a vendor ID. So create the vendor ID to ensure that information is going to be processed and on our reports at the end of the year. The 1099 NEC is strictly for services, correct? Yes. So we only issue 99s for the payment of services, not for goods. For non-employee compensation, those are payments to vendors for services. That is correct. Next question for bulk load agencies: how will the deadline for programming changes be announced? That will come from SFS. There's nothing right now. I know the folks at SFS will be working with their contacts at each of our bulk load agencies to make them aware of those changes and deadlines and make sure there's enough time to make those changes in the systems for bulk load. And Kim Martin, one of our SFS folks, mentioned that the quarterly SFS bulk load meeting, they'll be providing updates and we'll provide dates through that bulk load meeting. So thank you, Kim, for that information. The question is, how do you change withholding on 2 distribution lines in SFS? So if, again, you go to that withholding link on the invoice information tab of the voucher, it will list each line of the voucher and you can update the withholding on each line using that withholding link. The question was, how do you change withholding on 2 distribution lines? There's also some guidance out there in the GFO on processing vouchers for payment. There's also information in SFS Coach, some UPKs on how to process vouchers, and it goes through that, selecting the withholding for 1099 reporting. Really appreciate everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody for attending. I hope you all have a great day.